So I think I said once that I would not do this again. In other words, go through our kind of like quick mini review. But in thinking about the class today, I thought it would be useful. So um, the main reason, though, I'm not just going to list the things we've done. I just want to emphasize that so far, other than the assignment having to do with composition, we've really been dealing with the problem of how to paint an object. And really, we've been dealing with a single object, unless we include, say, background in relationship to an object that we might name, like here, a cone, something like that. And we've talked at length about a number of different things related to painting an object. So value perception, so seeing value and being able to record those values in your painting. So that the values, again, meaning the degree of lightness or darkness of objects in relationship to one another. And we've talked at length about the elements of light and shadow, incredibly important when we're painting, when we're trying to make convincing paintings of three-dimensional objects. And I'm actually I'm going to show a video to reinforce some of those ideas. It's a video I usually show right at the beginning when we first start dealing with light and shadow. And I haven't shown, I simply forgot to show it. It has been on Blackboard since the beginning, but I simply forgot to show that video. But I want to show it again, just as reinforcement, but also because people have been doing a very good job throughout most of the semester dealing with light and shadow. Your observation, and this is true for almost everybody, your observation of light and shadow was less successful on the draperies. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is that a drapery is more complex, so you're dealing with a more challenging problem. And making everything work when as things become more and more challenging, just gets more and more difficult. I also noticed that there seemed to be what's the right word? A kind of technical problem in your setups, where because you were setting up the drapery in a box, you had to have the light positioned so that the light was coming more from the front than would have been ideal. And that's sort of my fault. I should have warned you about that. And it had to do with the fact that you had to set the drapery up on the back wall of the box. Whereas with the objects, like the pieces of fruit, you could set them up closer to the front of the box, so you were able to get a better raking light. In other words, light coming from the side, as we're seeing in this painting here. That's sort of my fault. But there is also I think as objects or situations that we are painting get more and more complex, I think it's easier to fall into a kind of default mode of a kind of copying, a kind of automatic copying. And what I mean by that is, and I talked about this last week with at least one student, when we're making the kinds of paintings we're trying to make, right? These paintings where we create a convincing representation of a three-dimensional object on a flat surface, we are in a sense copying. Like we're looking, although only in a very simplistic way, or that's a very reductive way of putting it. But we are looking very hard at an object in front of us and then trying our best to recreate our perception of that object on a flat surface. But because we're doing that, because we're looking at the three-dimensional spatial world and trying to recreate that impression on a flat surface, we actually have to do more than just copy. Purely copying doesn't create as convincing an illusion of three-dimensional volume as possible. What we have to do is we have to know some of the basic principles of things like light and shadow, of certain drawing techniques, of color and color adjustment. And when we're looking at objects and painting them, we're not only copying what we see in front of us, but we're also painting what we know should be there in order to make as convincing an illusion of the three-dimensional world as possible. And the fact is, when we're looking at a setup, it doesn't necessarily contain in as clear a way as possible all those elements of light and shadow and so on that are going to help us create as convincing an illusion as possible. So there was a famous drawing teacher at the Art Students League in New York, which people have never heard of it. It's a famous old school. It's not like an accredited college. It's a famous old American art school. It's still there on 57th Street. There's a teacher there named Robert Beverly Hale, who wrote these very influential books on drawing. They're actually really good books. One of them is called Drawing Lessons from the Great Masters. Very useful book. And Hale says in that book that in order to be as good a drawer as possible, you go through a kind of process where first you draw what you see, and then you draw what you know. That's sort of the second stage. And then you see what you know. So what that means is, you know, an artist's first kind of naive approach to drawing or painting. Again, I'm talking specifically about this approach we're taking, where we're trying to make a very convincing representation of the three-dimensional world on a flat surface. An artist's first kind of naive attempt at that is to look at whatever it is they're painting and then copy it, you know, or try their best to copy it. And that's certainly what I used to do. I used to just look and just try to get everything in there, you know, I could possibly see. And what I ended up with inevitably was a mess. Like, even if I liked it at the time, looking back, it's a mess. But then an artist will learn certain elements of the way we see things, the way light works on objects, again, color relationships, and they'll know to put those in to that thing that they're seeing in front of them in order to make as convincing an illusion as possible. And then what ends up happening is you realize that those things you know are actually there in the reality we're looking at. It just took the process of learning those things to be able to really see them clearly. So again, an artist goes from drawing or painting what they see to drawing or painting what they have learned and know, and then actually seeing what they know. So part of the paintings you all did of the draperies, I think that there was still the process, there was a necessary process that maybe wasn't quite as completely realized in everybody's work, and for totally understandable reasons. It's a hard thing to get to. But people didn't quite see those elements of light and shadow that were definitely there. So just based on the images of the setups you sent me, those elements of light and shadow, so light side, dark side, reflected light, core of the shadow, halftone, highlight, cast shadow, shadow accent, all of those elements were there. You just weren't seeing them clearly enough and insisting in your paintings that they be there in the paintings to make as clear a representation of the three-dimensional world as possible. So it's just something to keep working on. And so I want to just emphasize that as part of what I want to remind people of today. So really studying the objects you're painting and looking for those elements we've talked about in this class that help you as clearly as possible make a convincing illusion of the three-dimensional world on a flat surface. So As part of that process, just going over again, we talked about planar structure as it exists on objects we're looking at. We moved on to warm and cool temperatures, and I'm going to revisit this painting in part of what we do today. So we started our introduction to color just in terms of warm and cool colors using white, transparent red oxide, and black. And then obviously this isn't a painting we did in the class. This is a painting from the Metropolitan Museum of Art by Peter Claes, C-L-A-E-Z. This is a still life, a limited palette still life. So we did the draperies we used a limited palette, right? We used white, black, ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, transparent red oxide. And I think people can probably see that in this painting, we are convinced of the color range. My guess is people don't look at this and say, well, there's some color lacking there. But notice that all of these colors could easily be achieved with those very neutral, limited colors. So the reds would be a pigment like the transparent red oxide we used. This blue might have a little bit of ultramarine blue. It's more likely black with a little bit of ultramarine blue. Anyway, we progressed onto a limited palette still life. Now I'll come back to this painting in a moment. And so the next assignment, moving forward, taking into consideration, hopefully, the work we did with the color stars, the next assignment will be to move from this limited palette painting to a full spectrum palette. So a palette where you have all colors available to you, okay? So the next assignment I want you to start working on today is a more complex painting than those we've done so far. So we've been painting a simple object, against a relatively simple ground. Then we introduced the drapery, which is a more complex object. And then we talked about composition. We talked about color mixing with the color stars. So all of those things I'd like people to bring together into a more complex painting. So I want you to do a painting now that has at least 3 different elements in some kind of believable space. So I used to assign at this stage in the semester, I used to assign a more complex still life. So let's say something like this. This would be a good resolution of this assignment, right? So a more complex situation, so of at least 3 elements in a believable space. So this is one way of interpreting it, right? And here we have 7 or 8 elements in the shallow still life space that the artist has set up. But I'm actually not going to limit people to simply a still life. If you want to explore something more complex or more unusual, that's totally fine. So these were kind of some randomly put together images by different artists I came up with before class today. So this is a painting by a contemporary artist named Catherine Murphy. And so this is a kind of still life. I think everybody can probably see what this is. This is just sort of, the corner of a door, right? So the artist is looking at the door frame, what do we call this again? The wainscoting, is that what that's called?
This one is more interesting.
Yeah, this is more.
So the wainscoting, the blue wall, and so on, right? So, you might, I mean, there's any number of different options you could choose for things to paint. Notice here how Catherine Murphy, she's chosen a kind of, again, a corner of the room. Where's the light coming from? Can anyone see where the light's coming from?
From the upper left side?
Yeah, the upper left side. It's kind of subtle, but right, the upper left side. So the planes, say, on the molding that are facing up towards the light are illuminated. This, form here, which is, we might compare it to a column, something like that, goes from light into shadow. There's also obviously light sneaking in from a room behind, right? So I guess this is a door here. These were kind of randomly chosen. So this is an interior by, an artist that a lot of painters love named Wilhelm Hammershøi. This is a painting from around 1900. This is an interior. You could do an interior. I would advise you to leave out a figure. I mean, that just adds a layer of complexity that I think might be a little bit too much. And since I'm asking people always to work from life, you'd have to ask someone to pose. So it's probably unlikely. So, but this is an option, right? You could do an interior. So here, instead of a still life with multiple objects in a believable space, here we have an interior, several objects. Here again, 7 or 8 in the believable space of the room, right? The floor and the walls of the room. Now, one thing I want to point out with each of these paintings is something I'd like people to be conscious of is that while we've been painting individual objects and all of the elements of light and color on an individual object, so light and shadow, cast shadow, light and shadow highlight, and so on. Notice how in this painting, the artist is hyper conscious of those elements, but the artist is also looking at how those elements interact with one another. So we have the cast shadow from the feather here, raking across the surface of the table, and then jumping up along the book, creating a clear sense of unity and atmosphere between all these different objects in the setup. So you want to be looking for those elements of value, color interaction, light and shadow, not only on individual objects, but on individual objects and how they relate to one another. In this Hammershøi painting, you'll see the same thing. The cast shadow from the table and the figure rakes across the floor, rides up along the sofa. The sofa, because it's a reflective surface, not only is there this cast shadow here, but there's also the reflective surface reflecting the light, the cool light coming from the window. There's the light hitting the wall. We have the shadow along the back wall. So an artist who's very conscious of observing light and shadow. Hammershøi is a kind of very subtle, elegant classicist. I'm not necessarily advocating for this style of painting. It's just a very clear example of someone dealing with the problem of painting multiple objects in which each of those objects are very convincingly represented, and then a convincing representation of those objects interacting with one another.
Professor?
Yes.
Hi, are we allowed to do landscapes?
Well, you can do a landscape. It has to be from life. So you have to be willing to go out and do it from life. It absolutely cannot be from a photograph. And the other challenge of doing a landscape, as you can probably guess, is that the light changes dramatically. So when you are working on a landscape, you have a window of about an hour a day to work on it, because after about an hour, the light will have changed too much. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But, maybe given the fact that you all have other commitments, other classes, if you set up an hour every day to work on the landscape from the same position, you could do it. It's possible. So yes, it does it does, it's a kind of technical, there are technical challenges with that. But I will say yes, but again, just be wary and, very conscious of the technical challenges. I'll pull up a couple landscapes to talk about, just talk about some of the issues we've been dealing with and how they are realized in landscape paintings.
Professor, would we have to send you a photo of the landscape that we paint?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I always want to see that. And you can, if you want, you can do a landscape like out your window. Like, I don't know, you can set up in any room that you have available. If you have a view out a window of a landscape, that's fine. So yes, I want to give some leeway. It's just, landscape, I feel like I'll be honest, I feel like it's a stage, maybe like a stage beyond where we are in terms of complexity and the challenges of painting a landscape. Because, really the challenge is to start to master these basic elements of paintings. So issues like, again, value relationships, color perception, light and shadow. And it can get very difficult with the landscape. But I'll talk about it. I'll pull up a couple landscapes and just talk about it. So just bear those difficulties in mind. So, oops. Oh, I didn't. Let me insert. Not that this is not a exhaustive account by any means of the different approaches you could take, but just because I know, because of the approach that we take to painting in this class, usually a kind of classical image is either more clearly explanatory of what we're doing, or maybe it just occurs to me more easily. But this is a Van Gogh painting, I think a great painting. It's at the Yale University Art Gallery at New Haven, so it's possible to see. So this is an interior, right? We've just looked at the interior by Hammershoy, a very different kind of interior. They were painted at around the same time. But so if while there's a great deal of what we call expressive mark making, this is a kind of expressionism. Notice all of the elements that we've been studying that Van Gogh is using. So he's very conscious of light and shadow, particularly in the way the pool table is represented. Notice how he's very conscious of the temperature of the light, those kind of hot lights that are illuminating this interior. He's clearly painted the cast shadow. He has a very clear sense of the space, right? There's a very dramatic, convincing sense of the depth in this room. Some parts of the painting, and this is typical of Van Gogh, become very flat, right? And where he's not conscious of light and shadow. So let's say what we, I think, read as the curtain in the background. We have no sense of lights and shadows on that. So if you were going to take and approach something more like this, you would want to be dealing with light and shadow the way he's dealing with it, say, on this pool table in relationship to the floor. You'd want to be doing that throughout. But it is certainly possible to solve some of these problems that we've been talking about in a way that doesn't adhere strictly to a kind of classical realism, for want of a better phrase. It's not. I don't like that phrase too much. Okay. So actually, I want to add an image to this. Okay, so before we go on, does anybody have any questions about the next assignment? Any other questions about the next assignment? Again, I'll show some possible images. And again, the assignment, okay, by the way, on Blackboard, it just says full spectrum still life. But again, it can be, it doesn't have to be a still life. It simply has to be a representational. So in other words, a painting where you're making a convincing illusion of of objects in a three-dimensional space. So it could be a still life like this. It could be, a kind of, an idiosyncratic or unusual still life point of view, something like this. Could be an interior. And yes, it could be a landscape as long as you're conscious of the challenges of painting landscapes. So that's the assignment. Again, at least 3 objects in a clearly articulated, a clearly defined space. Okay. So that's the kind of basic assignment. Does anybody have any questions about that?
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
So by full spectrum, you mean we can use any color, or full spectrum is more specific?
No, full spectrum, yeah. Basically, you can use any color. I'll talk about that today. You can use any color. I would like people to be using the full spectrum in order to try to make the colors you're looking at. So in other words, in order to be able to create a convincing sense of the colors you're looking at so that you build up those skills. But we will be using a full range of color. Does that make sense?
Is it okay if it ends up being like 4 objects? Because in my backyard that I'm going to use, there's a fence.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, it should be at least 3. I mean, I wouldn't go crazy, just because you do have several weeks to paint it. So, it is going to be a more complex painting. So, but yes, that's fine. But so if you also are going to paint your backyard, then again, just be really conscious of, like when you can't paint it it's not going to, you can't paint it like one day at 9 in the morning and then the next day at 4:30. Do you know what I mean? Like the light would be totally different. You have to still be working with a consistent light source. Is that going to be possible?
Yeah.
Okay, then that's fine. So any other questions?
Professor, is
Uh-huh.
this going to be the last assignment?
This will be the last assignment. Yeah, we'll work on this for the rest of the semester.
Okay.
I'm still actually debating. I may still give that final abstraction as a kind of homework. So I'll let you know within a week, okay? One other thing I do want to, I just want to throw out there is we did our studies, we did our compositional studies of the paintings, right, that we went over last week. Should be due today. If people need a little bit more time, that's fine. But so the objective of those assignments was to start to think about how artists carefully consider to put it very simply, the placement of all the different elements in the painting in relationship to whatever shape they're working on. Right? So a very careful arrangement of the different elements within this shape. Like how and why is the artist choosing the compositional arrangement? And so I'd like you all to think about that too. Don't just randomly put things down and then start randomly, just randomly place them within the rectangle. Start to try to think about the arrangement of the different elements, as much as possible in the way we talked about it last week, or when was that? 2 weeks ago with the paintings we looked at. And sorry, so, and I'm obviously we just introduced it a couple weeks ago. I'm not expecting, masterful, although all of you have done excellent work this semester. But, I'm not expecting a masterful resolution of composition, but start thinking about it. Something I'd like people to start being conscious of. And if anyone, we can go over a few more paintings and talk about that a little bit more if anybody wants. Let me ask, let's just very quickly thinking about composition. If we look at the composition of this painting, so just think about how the different elements are arranged in the painting. So this is an interior. And then let's compare it to the Van Gogh. I didn't intend to do this, but let's just compare it. The composition, so the way that different elements are arranged in the painting. You can also think about the color choices. So the color in the Van Gogh compared to the color in the Hammershøi. What are some important differences, and what do those different, or what kind of response or narrative do those compositional choices create if we compare these two interiors, which were made at right around the same time?
I think that for this one that you're on right now, the fact that he made the light source coming from the side, the shadows kind of like are on a slant, so it's more dynamic. But for the Van Gogh, his shadows, since his light source is in the center, his shadows are like right under the objects. I don't think it's so dynamic.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's a good point. So just pointing out the way this is an element, the shadow, that creates a kind of dynamic angle. That's true. And he's playing that angle off against the horizontals and verticals in the painting. Because in one way, there's part of this painting that is very strictly horizontal and vertical, right? This back wall. We're looking straight at the door, at the wardrobe, and at the picture on the wall, right? So that's very dramatically, or it's very assertively vertical and horizontal, so grid-like. And then against that, he's playing the dynamism of the cast shadows. It's a really good observation. Also against that kind of rigid geometry, he's also playing the curves of the sofa, the curves of the top here, the curves, the organic curves of the figure. So that's a good observation. He's placed this object here, right, as again, picking up on that curve, picking up on this curve, picking up on this curve. So that's certainly something that he's doing. Anybody else? Like what's a compositional choice that Van Gogh is making here?
He's like kind of like breaking up the field, so it kind of makes you feel like you're woozy, like as if you're in a bar.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. I mean, and a really important part of this painting. Van Gogh has arranged the composition. Who was that, Kayla? Who mentioned that?
Yeah, that was me.
So Van Gogh has created a composition where he creates a kind of wooziness, right? Like, like these guys look drunk, right? This is late at night in a cafe, it's called, but we assume they're drinking some kind of alcohol. Not only is he creating that sense of maybe drunkenness, even a kind of despair represented by these figures, but also it's maybe creating a sense of some kind of psychological experience that is not terribly stable, right? Where this painting, the painting by Wilhelm Hammershøi, is, the clarity of the composition is creating a sense of order, of calm, of repose, and so on. And all of those attributes are associated with a kind of classical approach to painting. The idea that you know, at least insofar as classicism is often associated with a kind of rational approach, you know, a kind of rational model of the world. Where Van Gogh is clearly working against that, right? He's creating a narrative of a kind of psychological tension, you know, and that's related to that kind of wooziness. So that's absolutely happening here. What are a couple of things he's done to make that, to communicate that in the painting?
Sorry, Professor, can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. What are, if in this painting, like again, as opposed to the Hammershøi painting, which is very much about, you know, a kind of classical stability, if there's a communication of wooziness or a kind of like psychological, you know, a kind of psychological instability in this painting, how is he doing that through the composition?
I think especially with the pool table, like the way he's playing with the forced perspective, like he really elongates it as if it's coming at you. And like also with the lights, like they're all very round, very everything. It's just interesting. Also how he does it with the lighting, like the lights aren't the brightest thing and all of a sudden the floor is very bright, and the way he's playing with his shadows, and like everything is kind of on a curve. Like it's not like so strictly straight.
Yeah, all of those things I think are really good observations. So he's heightening the contrast of lights and shadows, right? Almost as if you're having a sort of hallucinogenic or heightened experience of what you're looking at. That's true in the colors too. And then you're right, the forced perspective. So the drama of that pool table moving backwards in space, as if the world is moving faster than it should be, right? Or as if we're having that experience. The distortion of the size of the cast shadow to the size of the tables, the intensity of the lights, all of those decisions are contributing to that sense of a kind of psychological, or that particular psychological narrative that Van Gogh is setting up. So those are all really good observations. So I just want people to start thinking about how you're composing your paintings. You know, what are your decisions about placement? How are you framing the objects? We'll just start thinking about that as much as possible at this point. So let me, so just talking about that. Let me see if I can think of. So let me just, for the people who asked about painting landscape, are there any landscape painters that you're interested in? I thought I had a better Antonio Lopez Garcia landscape. Let's see. So now that I have Antonio Lopez Garcia, so Okay, so this is Antonio Lopez Garcia working in a landscape. So he's out there. He's a very committed landscape painter, and you know, this just I think is interesting. He will set up this. He'll make this elaborate setup out in the landscape, and then he will work on this painting for about an hour every day, only during like a 2-week period of the year, and then he'll put it away, and then he'll go back at that same time the next year. So he's very obsessive about that. But that's the kind of approach you have to take if you're going to be dealing with light and shadow and so on. So notice, I don't know how well you all can see it, notice the buildings right here in the center of his painting, the transition of light to shadow, light to shadow, light to shadow, light to shadow. That's these buildings right here. So he's paying very careful attention to those elements that we've been dealing with in much more simple forms. So okay, this is oh, hold on, sorry. This is an Antonio Lopez Garcia landscape. So, you know, he's clearly paying attention to light and shadow, light and shadow, light, shadow. You know, it becomes very complicated though. So, but again, if you want, I certainly, you know, that's certainly acceptable. So this is a view of his backyard, since someone mentioned a backyard. So, you know, this would have been done, he only would have had a very brief period while the light was raking across the wall, you know, to work on that landscape. So again, just be conscious of that. But, you know, if you're very conscious of all those elements, I would certainly encourage you to do that, to do this. So one thing I want to point out here when we're talking about light and shadow, he has a lot of, when you look at his paintings in reproduction, sometimes they seem like they're highly detailed. If you actually see these paintings, if you see them in person, they're not quite as detailed as you think. They're painted with a series of kind of broken patches of color indicating the transitions of light and shadow and so on. Nevertheless, there is certainly a very careful observation here. I'm showing this just because this would be a great thing to do. You know, you could, instead of setting up a still life, you could just go paint one that's sort of ready-made, like a sink in your bathroom or something. Would work totally fine. Again, as long as you have a convincing and clear sense of light and shadow, a light and shadow setup. So one thing to be aware of, and this is where things get a little bit challenging or difficult with landscapes. So he's looking at the light raking across this brick wall. He's noticing he's very carefully observing how the light illuminates the shape on the wall, and then all of this goes into shadow. Now he's seeing a lot of different things, right? He's seeing these patches of dirt as opposed to these patches of grass. He's seeing a little shrub here. He's seeing dirt that has a variety of textures in it. He sees some kind of little cement structure here within that shadow pattern. But if you squint at this, so if people looking at your screen right now, if you squint so that you make the image blurry, notice how everything he's observed in this big shape of shadow here all sort of integrates into each other, right? All of this stuff is very close in value, and everything within these big shadow masses is much darker than anything within these light masses. So you're going to want to be really carefully paying attention to that kind of variety of light or that kind of ordering of light and shadow, just as we've been doing all semester. And let me just pull up one other so let's just look at a Monet painting, famous landscape painter. So we'll look at a couple Monet paintings just for contrast and for something to be aware of in painting the landscape. So a kind of famous Monet painting, and then another famous Monet painting. So, okay, so here, like let's say you had a couple haystacks out your back window. This would be a great choice of a subject matter to paint. So these objects in the landscape, the clarity of the sunlight, the clarity of the light and shadow on these different forms. This is a great option. Notice on this haystack, we have the light and dark, we have the cast shadow. So all those elements, we have the reflected light, all those elements of light and shadow, of color, of value perception. Those are all very clearly, he's working from a motif or working from objects where he has all of those elements that we've been studying very clearly given to him, right, in what he's looking at. So Monet, who was a very great painter, this is a landscape. Now, what characterizes the light and dark here? So the landscape we just looked at, there was a clarity of light and shadow. What's the situation he's painting here? Like, or what's the light situation?
It's pretty cloudy.
Everywhere.
It's cloudy, right. He's painting on a cloudy day. So you don't get a lot of clarity of light and shadow. Right, when it's a cloudy day, you get at best very subtle lights and shadows, which you can see a little bit here in the bushes. You know, he's done, in this painting, a magnificent job of communicating the way colors appear to us under a certain weather condition. But, you know, I really think that this kind of light in the landscape should be avoided at this point. You know, I'd like to see people working with a clarity of light and shadow. So that just throws another complexity into that, right? Because you don't have the opportunity of clearly directing a light on a setup. You have to have a landscape where that's very clear. You know, like here, again. Here, let's see, which one is... This is a kind of version of that where the light's coming from behind this fence. So again, just be aware of all of those different problems or potential difficulties. So, okay, so again, I want to just ask, are there any questions about the next assignment? Anything I can clarify? Okay.
Sorry, do we do this on a panel?
Yeah, I do it on a panel, yes. You can do it on anything you want. If people want to do something, because we have several weeks to do it, and I forget what size the panels are, maybe 11 by 14. But if people want to, if people would like to go out and buy a larger canvas or a stretched canvas, that's fine. You can certainly do that. You don't have to, but you certainly can. So, but yeah, it would be at least a panel, at least 11 by 14 panel. Okay, so I want to, again, just talk about a couple things. Actually, let me finally show that video I've mentioned, I mentioned earlier, just because I want to revisit a couple things about light and shadow, just as a reminder. So I'll pull that up on YouTube. So, and this again is on, it's on Blackboard in case anybody wants to refer to it again.
Shade is how light affects the appearance.
Okay, so these videos I find, he's actually pretty clear about describing certain things. And I like to show this because we've talked about all this, but he has access to a kind of animation that is helpful in explaining light and shadow. And, you know, I think it's often good to offer a different explanation as a way of reinforcing what we've been learning. By the way, a lot of you know, I've noticed in the past few years, there are just tons of instructional videos, and a lot of them are pretty good. Like this one is pretty good, this video here. You know, stupid title, mind-blowing realist shading
Hey guys,
techniques.
welcome to Proco. Today we're
But
bringing
so there's a
you
lot
Dorian
of resources.
Keating, a great artist and master of shading light and form. He'll be
So anyway, so let's watch this.
shade is how light affects the Hey, welcome to Proco. My name is Stan Prokopenko. A lot of you have been asking for a video on shading. The first thing you need to understand when starting to shade is how light affects the appearance of form, and how to properly capture the three-dimensional form based on the characteristics of the light in the scene. In some of my previous videos, I talked about things like shapes, values, and edges. But how do we know what shapes, values, and edges to draw? What exactly are we looking for? Well, we're looking at light and how it illuminates the objects in our picture. Light is the reason we see anything, and the characteristics of the light can completely change the appearance of the objects it illuminates. So I like to analyze the light in the scene and try to capture it so the viewer can feel the light. Form looking three-dimensional is just a byproduct of correctly capturing the light on the form. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that studying light on form is important. Now let's take a look at all the elements. For this, I'm going to need an egg. For this, I'm going to need an egg. There are two main zones, light and shadow. The edge where the form transitions from light to shadow is the terminator. It's located at the tangent between the light source and the form. In other words, just before the planes start to face away from the light. Let's start by talking about the shadow side. There are two types of shadows. Form shadow is a shadow caused by the planes turning away from the light source. A cast shadow is caused by one form blocking the light from hitting another form. This egg is blocking the light from reaching this part of the table. You can find this shape by projecting lines from the light source to the terminator of the first form, and continuing those lines to the obstructed form. Shadows will rarely be completely black. Light bounces off objects in the environment and is reflected back into the shadows. This is called reflected light. In this case, the light will bounce off the paper and into the shadow on the egg. Along the terminator, sometimes you'll see a core shadow. It's a darker plane that defines the edge of the shadow. The thickness and softness of the core shadow can vary quite a bit. It depends on the thickness of the form, how sharp the edge is between the planes of light and dark, or the angle and position of the reflecting light source. Sometimes you won't see the core shadow at all, only if there is something on the shadow side to reflect back enough light to create a visible difference in value. This dark piece of paper reflects less light than the white paper. You can see a drastic difference in the value of the reflected light. Also, regarding the visibility of a core shadow, the reflection has to come from the right angle. If it's directly behind the shadow side, it will create a nice core shadow. If we move the reflection source closer to the angle of the main light source, it will illuminate the area where the core shadow would have been. If you don't see a distinct core shadow, many artists choose to cheat one in because it could add to the three-dimensionality of the form.
So people can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to reinforce that point he just made. So he's talking about these different elements of light and shadow. And he says, and I think he makes a really good point, that sometimes artists will, if there isn't a clear light and shadow, they'll cheat one in. So in other words, just because you don't see clearly one of those elements, let's say of light or of color, that you know are going to add to the believability of the illusion, it doesn't mean you can't put it in, right? You want to find those elements of light and shadow in what you're looking at, even sometimes when you have to cheat something in order to clarify and make the illusion as clear as possible. So that's a really important point he makes. And I like that phrase, cheat it in. Sometimes you have to cheat things into the painting.
Reflected light doesn't just affect form shadows. It also affects cast shadows. Less light can bounce into this deep crevice where the egg and table meet, and so that area gets darker as it goes deeper. This is called an occlusion shadow. Moving on to the light zone. Immediately after the terminator is the halftone. These are planes of the form that are partially hit by the direct light. As the planes get closer and closer to facing the light, they will get lighter. And the point where the form points directly at the light is called the center light. Don't confuse the center light with the highlight. The difference between the two is that the center light is the plane facing the light source, whereas the highlight is a reflection of the light source. A reflection will move depending on where the viewer is. So let's say this is the egg. The viewer or the camera is down here, and the light source is over here. The center light will be here facing the light source. The highlight, however, will need to be at the point where the light can bounce off the surface of the egg and reach the viewer's eyes. These two angles need to be equal. If you've played billiards, this is very similar. To test this concept, let's mark the point of the highlight. And mark another point for the center light. Now let's move the camera and see what happens. Okay, you can see here that the highlight moved to a different spot, following the camera. The center of light hasn't changed. It's still pointing directly at the light source. Don't let the math of all this confuse you. Highlights and cast shadows that we discussed earlier can be changed, and they'll still look believable. Nobody's gonna call you on a highlight being in the wrong spot. I can take the highlight on this egg, move it to a different spot, and change the shape, and it still looks believable. I'll often change the shape of a cast shadow to better describe the form it's being cast onto. For example, if I have an object that casts a shadow appearing to go against the form of this paper towel roll is a cylinder. And to show that, I would change the cast shadow from the egg to wrap around the cylinder. I usually try to describe the form that the shadow is casting onto rather than the form casting the shadow. So give yourself artistic license. Learn the rules, and then learn how you can break the rules to improve your drawing. I want to let you guys know I'll be releasing a DVD very.
Okay, so I just think that he explains things clearly, and I wanted to emphasize that point about cheating elements in when necessary. Okay, so for next week, I'd like people to decide what they want to paint for this final painting. And for next week, I'd like you to have the painting sketched in. I think for next week, don't have any color blocked in, anything like that. And then we'll meet individually, and we'll just talk about whether what you're painting is going to work, and I might make some suggestions for composition changes or something like that. So for next week, just have the painting sketched in and we'll meet individually. Okay. So any questions about the next assignment? Okay. So I'm going to share my camera now, and we're going to talk about mixing with a full spectrum palette. But I also want to introduce one other something else I've talked a little bit about, but haven't. Let's see, what am I looking for? So this is a document I will, can everyone see that? Can everyone see this document?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a document I'll email, or I'll actually just put it up on Blackboard. So what I want to talk about is what's called oil painting media. So it's something that you make to help with your oil, or to expand the possibilities of the oil paint you're using. And actually, I'll pull up a couple other. So while that camera image is up, you can still see these images I'm pointing out, pulling up. Yes, you can see this other stuff.
Professor, we see a pepper and some paint.
Did you see that document a minute ago?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, I'll send that to people later. I'll put that up on Blackboard later. Okay. So, the first thing I want to talk about is, people may have noticed that when I mix the paints, I thin the paint with something called oil painting medium, or this mixture here, or this liquid here. I don't just thin my paint with mineral spirits. You can do that, and some artists just do that. But I've been using what's called oil painting medium. So I just want to talk about that a little bit, because I want to give people the option of using that if you want to go to sort of another, or just add a possibility to what you do in your work. So I'm just going to temporarily put this painting up here. So this is a painting. I'm sure people remember when I did this painting. So again, when I did this painting and all the other paintings, I thinned the paint using oil painting medium. So what is oil painting medium for? Okay, so when we use paint straight out of the tube, it has a kind of stiffness to it, right? And so there are all different ways of using that paint. But some artists and certain techniques, or some artists prefer the paint to be thinner. Okay, so I'm going to thin the paint now just using mineral spirits. So I dip my brush in mineral spirits, and I can thin the paint. And I can make a thinner layer. So I put down some yellow ochre. And it's okay to do that. The problem with thinning the paint with just mineral spirits is you're in effect removing a certain amount of the oil, right? That's what the mineral spirits does. It thins the paint by dissolving the oil. And when you make a painting that way, eventually your painting becomes kind of dry and chalky looking. In other words, it loses the intensity of the color. Now, there are ways to restore the color. I'm not sure this is going to work, but this painting has become, like all paintings do, a little bit dry and chalky. Whereas if I put some oil back on the painting, it restores, and I don't know if people have noticed this, but like let's say the shadow area of that painting has become kind of chalky, right? Because as the oil dries, you lose some of the glossiness and color intensity. Now, if I put oil back over that, some of that color intensity comes back. So, so notice the difference between here and here. We're getting more color intensity. So a painting is more likely to lose color intensity if you just thin the paint with mineral spirits. But if you add oil painting medium to the paint as you're working on the painting, you can thin your colors at the same time that the painting retains, the paint better retains its color intensity and its luminosity. It doesn't, you still lose a little bit of that gloss and that intensity when the paint dries, but not as much as when you're using just mineral spirits. So that's a reason to use, or that's one reason to use this, to use oil painting medium. So I want to give people that option of using that and how to make it. The other reason oil painting medium is useful is there's a technique in oil painting where you can change colors in your painting by doing something called glazing. Does anyone know what glazing is? Has anyone ever been introduced to that?
Yeah.
Okay, who's that? Okay, so what is glazing, Anna?
Glazing is like when you make the paint almost translucent and you put it on top of like a thin coat on top of whatever you painted.
Well, exactly. So glazing is a technique where you alter colors in your painting by laying down a very thin layer of a darker color over another color, okay? So let's just say, I want to make, let's say I'm not happy with the kind of gray of the tabletop in this painting. I want it to be more blue. So I can put a very thin layer of, let's just say, straight ultramarine blue over my background. So I've just taken straight blue. And this is glazing color over another color. Now, the paint underneath has to be totally dry, obviously. And I can spread that paint in a number of different ways. And so I want it to be just a subtle blue. Now, if you're going to be really working glaze like I'm doing here, the painting has to be very dry. Otherwise, you'll scrub up the painting underneath. And so what ends up happening is I can just lay a very thin layer of color over the paint underneath. And we can still see those variations between lighter and darker areas of paint that I put down previously. And this is a technique that was very widely used by painters before the 19th century. So painters would actually, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, but painters would actually do the entire painting completely finished in black and white or brown and white. And then they would make the color in the painting by simply glazing over the black and white underpainting. So watch what happens as I've made now a blue tabletop, and I'm gonna glaze the blue over that kind of warm brownish shadow. And so I'm just glazing the same color, but that blue is being influenced by that color underneath in the cast shadow differently than it's being influenced by the lighter areas of that tabletop. So I'm able to just glaze a solid color, a transparent layer of a solid color over a color underneath. And I can relatively simply change big areas of the painting. And let's say I wanted, because we were using a very limited palette when we did this painting, let's say I wanted to make the color of that orange a little bit more of an intense orange. So I can mix a very bright orange and I can glaze that very bright orange over the color I have. Just to increase the intensity I see on my screen anyway, that's not showing up so well. I don't know if it is on yours. So I can just give a little bit more intensity to that color area, and we still have the same divisions of light and shadow coming through underneath. So glazing is a technique that is widely used by painters. And it's an option people can consider. And to glaze like this, you really need oil painting medium. You really can't do it with paint straight out of the tube. I've heard some people say that they do. They just like very vigorously spread the paint out. But that doesn't seem like a good idea to me. That seems like you would very likely damage the surfaces underneath. And you can't really do it with just mineral spirits because just mineral spirits doesn't maintain enough of the color intensity of the new painting, of the paint you're putting down. So you really need oil painting medium. So for anybody who's interested in that, actually, let me mention one other thing. There's another technique related to glazing. Called scumbling. And scumbling is when you change a color underneath by putting a lighter color over it. So scumbling has a very different effect. And this isn't a very good painting to show you what I mean. Just because I would never scumble on this painting. But scumbling is when you take a lighter color and you glaze over a darker color. I mean, you put a transparent layer of a lighter color over a darker color. And what you get when you do that is a kind of smoky effect. You know, and for certain effects, people mentioned landscape today, a kind of smoky effect can often be appropriate in something like a sky. You know, if you want to make, let's say, mountains in the distance appear to be losing intensity because they're so far away, you can glaze over them. But it's anyway another related effect you can use with oil painting medium. So it's just something people can have as an option. Okay. So okay, so oil painting medium, you have to buy the ingredients. So you can actually, let me take that back. You can actually buy ready mixed medium. I don't recommend it because ready mixed medium, you don't really know what's in it. And oil painting medium, I would encourage people to try it, but you have to use it the right way, or it becomes more likely that your painting will do things like crack or peel, that kind of thing. And I just think it's dangerous to use ready mixed medium. But I will send people some possible options if anybody's interested in that. So I just want to point out that the way oil painting medium is traditionally made is it's a mixture of your solvent. So this is what we've been using to clean brushes. So mineral spirits, or in traditional mediums, turpentine. It's a mixture of solvent, the same oil that is used to grind oil paint, so linseed oil. So the paints we've been using are powdered pigments ground in linseed oil. So you make the medium by combining mineral spirits, linseed oil, and then something that's called a resin. So this is a synthetic resin that I use. It's called Liquin. It's made by Winsor & Newton. There's another synthetic resin made by Gamblin. It's called, I'm drawing a blank right now, I apologize, but it's on that document I will send people. What's that called? Gamblin. I'm forgetting, sorry. So there are a traditional version of this, which would be turpentine, linseed oil, and Damar varnish. So Damar varnish is a natural resin that comes from it comes from pine trees. What's that sticky stuff that comes out of the resin out of pine trees? So it's a mixture of these things. So I have the basic recipe on that sheet. So if anybody wants to make this, you can buy these three things. You can get these in much smaller containers. You can get a very small bottle of this, a small bottle of that, and you can experiment with making them. For people who are interested in taking painting beyond just this class, I would recommend trying at least oil painting medium. And not all artists use it, but it's certainly a possibility. I was going to do a demonstration of this. I just want to say, you need to make your medium carefully. So you need to do it using something like a measuring cup. You really can't just randomly mix these things together. Because if you do that, you'll again increase the chances that your painting will peel or crack or something like that. So if you decide you're going to use medium, you have to decide on a mixture. In other words, a percentage of each of those different elements. And then you have to stick with that mixture, that very carefully measured out mixture for the entire painting. You can't change the percentage of any of those ingredients. And then one last thing, and I hope this isn't terribly confusing. Certainly if anybody has any questions or if I can clarify in any way. The reason these three ingredients are used is by using these ingredients and varying the percentage of each, you can either increase the drying time, in other words, make your paintings dry more slowly, or you can make them dry faster. So by increasing these different elements, you have some control over the drying time of your paint. So if you add more linseed oil to your medium, your paint will dry more slowly. If you add more resin, your paint will dry faster. Mineral spirits also makes the paint dry a little bit faster. So there's a basic recipe for medium, but you can then vary it depending on your own needs as a painter. And again, this is something that I can talk about in more depth with anybody who's interested. But I just wanted to introduce this option. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay. All right, so what I want to do before we end today is I just want to talk a little bit about color mixing with a full spectrum palette. So let's do that in a few minutes. Why don't we first, though, take a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about color mixing, again, with this full spectrum palette. Okay, so I have 4:10, so let's come back at 4:25, okay? Okay, so, all right, so I just want to talk about color mixing with the full spectrum palette. So I have over here the full spectrum palette. And most of these colors are colors I asked you to buy. I may have a couple here that I didn't ask you to buy. So I have on the left side of my palette, I have white, cadmium yellow light, or you may have primary yellow, yellow ochre, which is an earth yellow, as you know. I have raw sienna, which is a slightly darker version of really the same color, yellow ochre, but it just gives a certain kind of versatility to the palette. I have our primary red. For me, this is cadmium red medium. I think some of you may have purchased Dick Blick primary red, which will work. I have quinacridone magenta, which is our red from the CMY color triad, the cyan, magenta, yellow. And then I have 3 earth reds. So I have Venetian red, burnt sienna, and then the first red we used this semester, transparent red oxide. So then on the upper part of the palette to the right of the white, I have the cool colors. So I have turquoise, which people will remember was our blue from the CYM palette. I have a green. I know you can't see it so well on the screen. Can you see that better? I have a green called Viridian, and that's just a green that I like. There are many different kinds of green that you can get. I happen to like Viridian. I think it's a very versatile green, but you don't have to use that one. It is, unfortunately, like some pigments, a bit on the expensive side. I think it's worth it, but you know, people may want to go for, if you want to have a green on your palette, you may want to go for a less expensive one. Then I have ultramarine blue, and then I have black. Okay, so now people can, this is a version of a full spectrum palette. And when I say full spectrum palette, that isn't, you know, some kind of palette that has an absolute definition. You know, a full spectrum palette, what I mean by that is it's a palette that will allow you to match most colors you see. Probably not all, but most colors. And so in other words, we're not dealing with the limitations we have been in our colors up until now. There are some other colors I want to point out that I like. I just didn't want to get too confusing, but there's a color called alizarin crimson. It's similar to quinacridone magenta. It's an older, more traditional, cool red. It's almost a kind of violet. That's a color I use. If you want a more intense red, something that'll allow you to get a more intense orange, you might try something like cadmium red light. It doesn't look that different on the screen from the cadmium red medium, but that's a color you can get a very intense orange with. This palette is something you can play with and expand, you know, however you want. What I want to concentrate on today is, again, going beyond what we've been dealing with so far, which is realizing that given the limitations of whichever palette we have been using, whether it was our Grisaille palette, which is extremely limited, or our warm cool palette, or our dead palette, we always knew that there was a certain limitation to the colors we could achieve in our paintings. That shouldn't be true anymore. So I want to just talk a little bit about color mixing with this full spectrum palette, bearing in mind what we've studied so far in terms of value, temperature, and then also bringing into our consideration of color mixing what we know from having done the color stars, or what I hope people know from having done the color stars. So let's try to match the colors we see in this setup, okay? So I'm gonna start, so let me ask, and I'm going to encourage people to participate, and I'll call on people if necessary. Given the blue we're looking at here, how would we start mixing that color? Knowing what we do about the colors we've had the option of using so far, and thinking about what we learned about color and color mixing from the color stars, how can we start to get that blue? Who wants to give a suggestion? How would we make that blue?
I
To
think
make
that
it
you could
blue?
use- Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, no.
Okay, go ahead, Tommy.
You asked to make the background blue.
Yes, the background blue. How would we start making that color?
I mean, I would mix the white and the blue one first, just to try to get a hint of it.
Right. So that would be the sort of important first step, right? So we're gonna start with blue because that's the hue we're looking at, right? Or the straightforward color we're looking at. But this color needs to change, right? And so that blue is obviously too dark. So we need to add white. So what we're doing is we are increasing the value. And I'm going through all these steps verbally because in a sense, these are steps you want to go through as you're trying to decide how to make the color we're looking at. So I've added white to our blue. And let's just put that down. So this is the kind of process we go through. So we mix, we start by asking what color we're looking at and what value it is. So if that's what we start with, that's not quite right? That doesn't quite work. So what needs to change about that blue? Who wants to take a stab at that? Like, what needs to change about it? Whoops.
You have to make it a little bit grayer.
We have to gray it down, right? So the blue that we mixed is too intense compared to the blue that we're trying to get, or the blue that we're trying to match. So how are we going to make that grayer?
We can use contrasting colors, like adding orange.
Yeah, well, so one option is adding orange to that, or one possibility, because we know, just based on our color stars, that when we take, that we can neutralize a color with its opposite, right? In other words, we can neutralize or gray down one color with its opposite. So we can try mixing orange with the blue as a way of neutralizing that. So I'm going to mix an orange. Let's just start with a pure orange. And then we'll mix that with the blue. And now I'm going to put that down. And let's see how we do. So we've certainly neutralized it, which is a good step. So what do we think now? So it's more neutral. It's not quite right. What could change about it? Like, what's off about it? Well, one thing is it's too dark, right? So let's get that issue out of the way by just adding a little bit of white.
Could you add the green to it? Or like that top blue one next to the white?
Well, why would we add green? I'm not saying no, but why would we add green? Like, what is it about the blue that to you seems like it needs more green?
Like, it doesn't look like it has a complete blue shade.
It's not quite this blue, right? And I see what you mean by adding green. What is the blue, this blue, what is it, what's the problem with it? That's too intense. What is this?
That's too gray.
It's a little too gray. Do people also see it's a little bit too purple?
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
mauve kind of.
It's what? Right, it's kind of a mauve.
Yeah.
It's a nice color. But so that indicates to me that we put a little bit too much red in with that orange. Does that make sense? So in our orange, there's a little bit too much red, and it's made that blue go a little bit too purple. So I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to it to just give a little bit more of a yellowness to that neutral color we mixed up. And then let's take that neutral color, and someone said it's too gray. And I think you're right. I think it's too gray. So let's add a little bit more blue to that mixture we already have. And we're almost there, right? What do people think? What could we do to that to make it nearly spot on?
Add a little bit more yellow.
I don't think so. I think you might be right, but I think the first step would be to add just a little bit more blue. I think that this is still a little bit too gray. Yeah, just a little bit more blue. But you might be right, Anna, if we're talking about getting it exactly right. Now, let me just emphasize, getting colors exactly right. It's not like you're not going to make a good painting unless you do that. This is more just an issue of being able to get the color you want. Being able to achieve that, whether you're doing a representational painting or not. I think we're pretty close. Right? We've done a pretty good job matching that blue. A little bit more yellow. I see what you mean. It still looks a little purple, doesn't it? Okay, so I think we're pretty good. So, anybody else think that this should change? Or anybody unsatisfied with the color we've gotten?
I think it's still too gray a little.
You still think it's still too gray?
It might just be my screen, but maybe like a little turquoise, like I don't know.
Okay, I'm gonna hold on to that, what you just said. And let's talk about the turquoise and talk about a couple other things related to this. So let's put this color down. I'm not ignoring what you're saying. I think if we have more of this color down, it'll help us talk about this. A little bit more blue in it. I mean, I'm not, if we're matching the colors, I'm not totally satisfied with it. To me, it still looks a little purple. And now, yeah, it definitely looks a little purple. Now, if I were working on this painting, if this were just a still life I was painting, I wouldn't be dwelling on this exact matching. So I don't want to mislead people into thinking, again, that mixing colors, it has to be some kind of exact science. Because the decision I would be making would be more, do I think the painting works? Not, do I think that this is exact or an exact match? But again, I think that some of these things are good to do just to sharpen your perceptual abilities, sharpen your ability to see colors and make the colors you want depending on your needs in a painting. So that I knocked out a little bit of the purple. Not quite at that blue. Okay, so as I'm looking at it, this is still just a hair too purple than that. Now, let's leave it. We could, keep going, try to get that exactly. Just for the purposes of time, let's leave it as it is, because it's certainly close. I just want to talk about a couple other things that people have mentioned. So who mentioned putting turquoise in it?
I did.
Janine, okay. So we used turquoise as our CYM blue, right? Now the only issue with the turquoise is that it's an extremely potent color. It's also a color that has a kind of artificiality to it. In other words, there's something about the look of it that seems artificial. So if we put that down, now it's possible, but it becomes extremely potent. Let's say I'm going to mix some of that directly into this. Because actually, now that I put it down, I see what you're saying. It's acting in a way to get rid of the violet, kind of violet look. Yeah, actually, I have to admit, Janine, I never would have thought that. In part, I think just because that's not my habit. But actually, that was a good observation. I think that did a lot to bring that closer,
Yeah.
just a little bit closer to that blue. It just takes down that. So I have to be honest with you. I started that because I was going to point out that this is probably too intense a color. But actually, I think you're right. It's a hair green, but that's okay. So we're good here. So now what about the yellow of the pear? I mean the pepper. Who wants to make a suggestion for that? Again, let's think of the process we're going to be asking ourselves as we're mixing colors. Who has a suggestion for the light side of the pepper? Gia, what do you think? Is Gia there? Fazia, what do you think?
I was thinking maybe the yellow and the white.
I'm sorry?
Like maybe yellow and white.
Okay, so which yellow?
The one right under the white.
I think that's probably a good option, or a good place to start. So let's do the same thing. So we need it to be a very bright, you need this to be a very bright value or a very light value, right? So actually, I'm going to just back off your suggestion a little bit. I'm going to start by not without any white. Let's see what happens if we just put down, and I may be wrong, let's see what happens if we just put down that yellow. I think actually if we put white into it, it's going to make the value maybe too light. Because something I'm looking at, I want to make sure that the value of this is the same degree lighter than that as this is compared to that. So I want to make sure I very clearly establish that value difference. So how does that value difference look? Like, does that seem to be the right difference in value, this compared to that, as this to that?
No, it's still off.
What's off about it?
I think it's too bright.
This is too light compared to that?
No, I think it's too bright.
It's too, you mean it's too intense? The color's too intense?
Yeah. Like maybe we can try to make it more muted.
More
That
what?
makes sense. Like more muted.
More muted. Yeah, I think that's true. I think that this is too yellow, right?
Yeah.
Too much of a pure yellow. So looking at this, what would we add to that to make it more like this? Anyone? Huh?
Oh, sorry. Could we use its color opposite purple? But I don't want it to be too gray.
Yeah, I think making like if we first of all, I like that instinct that you're saying let's add its opposite. So let's make its opposite. We'll make it purple with ultramarine blue and quinacridone magenta. So that's a very potent purple. And then I'm going to add a touch of that to the yellow. So if we put that down, what do you think? Does that get too gray?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's too gray. I mean, that was a good instinct, but it's too gray. So what else could we do looking at the light side of that, that pepper?
I noticed that the pepper looks kind of warm, so maybe you could add like a little pink or red into it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we can add, I think that's going to be, this is too much of a pure yellow, right? So there needs to be a little bit of red in it. Now, what do you think? Just looking at this color, and in this case, not thinking too much about like color theory based on the color wheels, just looking at this, do any of these reds seem more appropriate to you? In other words, just by the look of these reds, does one or the other look like it would be a better choice?
I'm thinking maybe I don't know the names of all of them, but either the magenta or the one underneath that.
So this Venetian red here, this earth red?
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of am feeling that's a possibility because what's going to happen is that's going to make it redder, which we want to do. And it's also going to just slightly neutralize it because it's an earth red, right? So it's already more neutral than the yellow.
Yeah, and also I don't know if maybe like the yellow ochre would help, like make it more.
Possibly.
You know?
But really both of your instincts were right. So Fazia was right. It needed to be a little bit less intense. And you're right, it needs to be a little bit redder. So adding just, I think, a little bit of I have a feeling adding a little bit of the Venetian red is going to start to get us close. Now that looks to me like that looks much closer. What do you think? Because we're keeping the value distinction, right? The very light compared to the relatively dark. And that color looks like a better color for that yellow. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it looks good.
So now that color may need to be changed a little bit. And I think maybe Fazia's, again, initial instinct to gray it down, we may need to go in that direction still a little bit more. But before doing that, let's just block in that color. And just so that we're working with a larger area. And by the way, I'm ignoring this part of it here, this halftone. That's a halftone, that's not a shadow. I'm going to put that in later. I'm going to simplify this into just light and dark at this stage. It's a very simple breakdown of light and dark. think we're at a decent, again, I think that this color, once we have more colors down, we're going to want to adjust it a little bit, probably. But I think it's a good place to start. Okay, so now what's a much harder color? Always, at least for me, maybe this is just me, the shadow colors. What are those colors in the shadows? Who wants to offer a color that you would use to describe the shadow mass on this pepper? What's the color on the shadow mass?
Would it be like a yellowish brown?
Well, I guess you could call it that. Why do you think, what is it about it that's making you say yellow? Do you really see yellow, or are you saying yellow because you know that it's a pepper and it must have some yellow in there?
Yeah, I guess I'm saying because I know it's a pepper, but it looks, I mean, it has like that undertone of a yellow, I guess that's why, but it looks brown to me.
Like, what if we cut that out? Do you think we would see yellow in there, or would we see something else? I mean, maybe you're right.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I just wanted to say, like, would it be like a really dark green?
Greenish. There's a kind of greenishness to it. What would we possibly use to, or what's a way we could perhaps think about trying to get that color? While we do that, I'm going to mix up the shadow, the cast shadow behind it. I'm going to mix up this cast shadow color just so we have that down. But what do people, like, what's a way we could possibly achieve the color that we're looking for on that pepper? The shadow side.
Maybe adding some violet.
Adding some violet to it, you mean taking yellow and adding violet?
Yeah, like taking some of the yellow, adding some violet and burnt umber.
Yeah, I think that you might be onto something. So that when I look at that color, to me, thinking about colors and their opposites is helpful for me in trying to figure out what color I would use for the shadow side of the pepper. Because now this isn't always the case. It's not always the case that you can mix up the shadows for an object just based on the local color of the object in question and its opposite. But just looking at that color, the shadow color on the pepper, I do see a considerable amount of violet in there. To me, it looks like a kind of gray violet. So by the way, I mixed up this, just before going back into that, I mixed up the shadow color for that cast shadow on the back wall by mixing ultramarine blue, and I mixed it with this earth red, which is called burnt sienna. And the reason I use that is, again, it has to do with color opposites, because I often think of burnt sienna as a dark, neutral orange. I find it to be a very useful color in that way. And so I will often use that to mix neutralized blues. I'll often use burnt sienna to neutralize blue. Just so we have that behind it. So let's try that. Let's make a violet. So I'm going to make violet using, now I could use quinacridone magenta, which would give a very intense violet, right? Like we talked about in our color wheels. So using quinacridone magenta is a good way to get these very intense violets. But I think I'm going to use, instead of using quinacridone magenta, because I'm trying to get what a gray violet, I'm going to make a violet by mixing ultramarine blue and one of my earth reds, one of my more neutral reds. So that's where I'm going to start. The violet that's made with ultramarine blue and Venetian red. And then I'm going to neutralize that, both neutralize that and lighten it with a little bit of yellow ochre. So I don't want to add, I could again neutralize that with cadmium yellow, but again, since I want to make a grayed down neutral color for that shadow, I'm going to use yellow ochre, which is already a relatively neutral color. A little bit more of the red in. So we want a kind of neutral violet. That's how I see that color. So again, I started with I started with a violet, a neutral violet that I made with ultramarine blue and Venetian red. And I neutralized that further with yellow ochre. And then I put a little bit of white. Now there are several different colors in there. So in other words, there's the color of the core of the shadow, there's the color of the main reflected light, and then there's the color of that very bright reflected light. What's causing that bright reflected light?
The canvas board?
Canvas board, right. The reflected light here is mostly being created by the light bouncing off the wood. And just so that, again, to talk about how reflected light works and how light is created in the environment we looked at, if I put my hand to the right of the pepper, notice how the light that's actually passing through the thin layers of skin and picking up red from the blood vessels and then bouncing back in to the shadow side of the pepper, how that becomes very orange. I take my hand away and it goes back to that kind of neutral gray. So the colors we're seeing in the environment around us aren't actually the colors that are located in that thing. They're colors that are created by all the other objects all around it. So it's something we have to remember. So we can't just think yellow pepper, fill in yellow. We have to think about the light that's hitting the object and how that light is being influenced by elements around it. So I'm going to put in as a first stab that kind of neutralized violet gray. And I'm going to see how that works. So now there's more than just one color in here. So I'm bringing the color up right to the cast shadow blue behind it because I want to make that value comparison. Right, so the color I put down for the shadows on the pepper have to be the same degree of lightness or darkness relative to that cast shadow behind it. That's one clue as to whether or not this color I'm choosing is working. And so just like always happens when we're first blocking in a painting, we have what looks like very stark differences between the light mass and the dark mass. But remember, when we're starting these paintings, we're starting very simply. We're just breaking the paintings down into the simplest arrangement of light and dark masses. Now compare the value and color of this cast shadow to the value and color of the shadow on the pepper. And then look at the object we're working from. I actually think that's a pretty good color. What do other people think? It's a pretty good color as a start.
Maybe a little bit darker on some edges.
It's darker in some places. Is that what you said, Tommy?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's going to be darker. Where specifically?
like where you're painting right now.
So do you mean in this part of the pepper?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's going to be darker for sure. But for now, I'm just putting down like the basic tone. So what do people think? Okay, so Tommy, I think, rightly pointed out that it's going to get a little bit darker in some areas. Anybody else have any other suggestions for changes? Now, one thing I want to point out is if we take that color, and I put it right here, that color comes off as a kind of dark, obviously dark, kind of purplish gray. And there's a completely understandable impulse to be looking at an object like this, painting an object like this, and saying, this is a yellow pepper. So this color here has to be yellow. That pepper is yellow, therefore that has to be yellow. But remember, the only reason we're seeing the pepper here as yellow, the only reason we're fully perceiving that local color is because it's strongly illuminated with light. The light it's not being hit by light over here anymore, except for indirect light. So that's diminishing our ability to see this yellow. So for all intents and purposes, the pepper is not yellow over here anymore, right? As we've seen, the pepper is this kind of neutral, relatively warm gray. And if we're going to successfully both create the illusion of light and shadow, illusion of form, we're going to start needing to see the colors as they actually are, not what we expect them to be. And also, just again, remember, if there's different surfaces behind it, that shadow is going to be a different color. That shadow really right now is a kind of orange with my hand there. So let me just quickly put down a couple things before we end today. I'm going to mix, like, what would I use to mix that gray? So I'm going to, okay, I'm going to go easy. I'm going to mix the gray of the cardboard, the pepper is sitting on by mixing black with white, and then it's warmer. That color of the cardboard that it's sitting on is warmer than just black and white. So I'm putting some of this raw sienna into it to get that warm gray, lighter than that. But I want to put this down just so we can see the colors of that shadow against the colors behind it. Now, I'm again looking at, when I put this color down, I'm looking at how that compares to the color I have down for the cast shadow in the background. And to me, this color relationship looks about right. So I think that's going to be a color that will work for this area. That warm gray of the cardboard. And I'm going to bring that right up to the pepper. It's the color of the cast shadow. And now I have lost the clarity of pepper, so I'm just going to add the shadow accent. I'm going to make it darker. I'm going to make another warm gray for the shadow accent. It's going to be darker. It's not going to be so much yellow in it. And I'm going to re-establish the drawing of pepper by bringing in, again, that shadow accent, that place, or as our YouTube videos call it, the occlusion shadow, which again I never heard that term as an art student. There actually is a whole kind of movement of technically minded artists now who are either adding or bringing back technical terms that were out of favor for a long time, which in a lot of ways is a good thing. Okay, so now, so this is obviously a very simple statement of light and shadow, right? So now we have to start to complicate that a bit. What can I do to this? What colors can I bring into that to change that?
Adding the white.
Okay, so now I personally would de-emphasize that reflected light. Because I think, this is a kind of aesthetic decision. I think that when there's a reflected light that bright, it tends to destroy or interfere with the believable sense of form. Because when it gets that bright, I feel like the viewer reads that part of the painting as popping forward. When it's this bright, it's as if that part of the pepper one is turning forward to catch the light over here. That's a little bit of a personal issue. But I always de-emphasize. To go back to what that video said, when there's not enough reflected light, I cheat in reflected light. But if it's too strong, I de-emphasize it. But but we can, let's bring it in. I don't like it, but let's bring it in. So all I did was add a little bit of white to that mixture, and actually a little bit of yellow. And You know, and I think that's about what's happening, right? And I want to paint this so that it's clearly sitting on a plane, because the only reason there's that reflected light in there is because the pear turns from a point that it doesn't face the reflected light to a point that it does, or the reflecting surface. So I want to paint it so that it reads as, again, as a plane. In other words, I want it to read as a turn in the direction of that form. What else? So we have that little reflection.
You can add the core shadow.
Core shadow, right. So the core shadow is a little bit darker, a little bit more neutral. And I actually think that picking up on Anna's point about the white of that strong reflection, I think that I can actually make my overall color and value of the shadow mass just a little bit warmer. So I'm going to, in part, make that core of the shadow not by darkening it, but by slightly warming up and lightening the main part of the shadow. So I'm just taking some of my neutral yellow or my earth yellow, yellow ochre, and I'm putting that into my mixture. Then I'm just going to warm this shadow up a little bit. And by doing that, by warming up and lightening the main shadow mass, I'm in effect creating that core of the shadow. I actually think that that slightly warmer color is better. I know you guys have glare on I know you have a little bit of glare. So you can often make, I guess that's in part my amateurish setup here. I should be like those YouTubers with their professional camera setups. Maybe someday. Hopefully, we won't be doing this much longer. I went to Queens College yesterday to pick up some things. It's the first time I've been there since March. It was really strange. Has anyone been there? Taking that as a no.
I haven't been there since March, but it was so tempting to go.
I'm sorry?
I haven't been there since March, but it's been so tempting to go.
Do people miss in-person classes, or do you kind of like it remote?
No, I miss in person.
Yeah, I love our campus.
Yeah, our campus is sick. Also, I just want to meet everyone already. Like, this is insane.
I know, it's getting depressing, isn't it?
Yeah, how are we supposed to make friends? Like, no one texts strangers, you know what I mean? You don't like be like, hi, I'm in your class. Like, it's not the same. It's different if you see the person, you know what I mean?
I also didn't mind at first. Like, I have to admit, I didn't mind, like, just, getting up in the morning and going to my kitchen table or coming here to my studio, instead of the commute. But now it's just gotten old.
Yeah, logistically, it's easy. Like, it's much easier, but when it comes to, like, I don't know, making a connection with someone, it's much harder.
Yeah, for sure. Also, you all have been doing a great job, as all of my students have, in learning painting remotely, but it's much harder to learn. I mean, much easier when you're in the studio. So I'm adding now the core of the shadow, as Anna pointed out. And so with that bit of work I did to the shadow, to the reflected light, and then with the core of the shadow, I think we're starting to get a nice sense of the colors of the shadow mass. Now, unfortunately, just looking at the screen, again, you all have a glare that I can't figure out how to totally get rid of that. But I'm hoping you're starting to be able to see those distinctions. And I just want to, I'll end it in a second. I just want to make sure about something. Now, when I look at the screen and when I look at my painting, I'm actually quite happy with the color of that shadow pattern, both in terms of value and temperature and color. Does anybody have any objection to this value or to its relative lack of yellow, if people know what I mean? Or are people convinced by this? So in other words, look back and forth from here to here. Does anyone have any question about whether this is working?
No, this looks pretty convincing.
Okay. So
I
yeah, I
agree.
just want to point out, you don't want to be, when dealing with lights and shadows, you don't want to be saying, again, yellow object, this must be yellow. You have to look at the color of the shadows based on what's happening in the particular light situation you're using. And then just one last quick thing before we end. I'm going to mix a halftone to start turning that edge. So a halftone is often cooler than either the light or the dark. So I'm going to mix a middle tone that's on the cool side. You know, and we talk so much about lights and darks in this class that sometimes I forget to emphasize the importance of turning that edge, right? Because we don't want this edge, you know, we're starting with the big masses of light and shadow, but we don't want the edge to be a sharp paper-like edge, right? It's not two pieces of paper meeting each other. It's a plane change. So the object of this organic object has turned, the form has turned from one direction to another direction. So we're going to get this soft, it's going to be a clear division of planes, but nevertheless, there's going to be a soft transition. Now, some transitions are harder than others, some are softer than others, but it shouldn't be an abrupt, papery edge. So I want to look at that, the color of that halftone and the value of the halftone, and bring it in so that I'm making that planar structure, but at the same time, I'm turning the edge. Now I can also, by the way, I can also use that halftone to start indicating, I can very subtly start indicating that dimple in the form. So the reason I left that out is that that's not a shadow. It's considerably lighter than the shadow mass. And I want to make sure I treat that with the subtlety that it should be treated with. So this is just a gentle shift in the direction of the form. The form turns from relatively up-facing to a relatively down-facing direction. And so it doesn't go into shadow, but it loses some of the intensity of light. So it's not completely turned away from the light source, it is instead at an oblique angle to the light source. So it's not quite picking up the same intensity of light, but it's still getting some light. So I want to make sure that I paint these halftones with the kind of subtlety that they should have. That's an important thing to do, is to start making distinctions between halftones and shadows. They're not the same. Soften that edge. And start to develop that. You know, and going further, I put in highlights and keep going. But so I just wanted to talk a bit about mixing, about color mixing with the full spectrum palette, you know, and working towards finding that full range of color. So again, let me just make sure that there aren't any questions I can answer about the next assignment. Does anybody have any questions? Go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted you to just explain the homework again. I know that we have the option to do a landscape painting, and then we can also like have our own setup of 3 objects.
Yeah, so I just want you to do a painting where I'll share, let me share my slideshow again. A painting where you, instead of doing just one object, you know, like we've been doing, I want you to do a painting that has at least 3 objects in a space. So it could be a more complicated still life, something like this. It could be an interior, you know, something like this, or a kind of unusual way of thinking about an interior like this. It could be a landscape, it could be like, you know, your kitchen sink and the stuff around it, or your bathroom sink like this artist. It could be a landscape. You know, again, landscape gets complicated, but does that make sense? Is that more clear?
Yes, I got it. Thank you so much.
Sure. I mean, if you're, you know, nervous about it, I don't know if that's quite what I mean, but it'd be completely acceptable to just do a simple still life of, you know, 3 objects, okay? But, you know, you can do something more complex for sure. So again, I'll modify the instructions on Blackboard to reflect this, but so a more complex painting with at least 3 objects in a space, and you're still going to be paying attention to making as convincing a representation of 3-dimensional form as possible, using light and shadow, value perception, and color perception. And then also try to think about composition, like how are you composing the painting? So really for this last assignment, we're trying to bring all the different elements we've been studying together. Okay? Is that more clear, Fazia?
Yes. Also, can we speak privately, like for a few minutes after this class is over?
You need to talk to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Yep. Okay. Any other questions?
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. So you just want to bring your, you know, just show me your drawing, your start next week. Okay, so I'll see everybody. I'll see everybody next week. And Fazia, we can talk when everyone's signed off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You,
Have a good week.
you too.
Thanks, Professor. Oh, I also have a question. So,
Sure.
yeah, I'll just wait a little bit.
Okay. Who had a question? I thought that was Jade, or was it Kayla?
I do have a question, but I think the first person was Fazia.
Okay. Fazia, did you need to talk in private or?
Yeah, I'll go last.
Okay.
Okay.
Then I have a question about like my degree. On the website, it lists you as like.
That's the advisor. Kayla, for some reason I can't hear you anymore. Diane, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Professor.
I can hear you now.
Kayla, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, so can you continue your question?
Oh, I was saying that on the webs like the degree website, it lists you as like the deputy chairman
Yeah,
or the advisor.
right.
And I was wondering if I should send you an email about like advisement and stuff like that, or if it's someone else that I should talk to.
No, yeah, just send me an email.
Alrighty, cool.
Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Diane, what was your question? You can't hear. Do you want to email me? Why don't you, Diane, just text me. I mean, chat or email.
Okay, can I text you?
I can hear you now.
Oh, you can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Yes, Professor, I have a question. Remember that we spoke last week about the borrowing composition assignment, the previous. I did step 1 and 2, but you said that we were gonna not to do step 3, that you were
Right.
gonna.
Yeah, don't do step 3.
Oh, just don't do it?
Yeah, just don't do it. I may ask people to do it later, but no, don't worry about it right now.
Okay.
Okay?
Wanted to make sure.
Okay.
That's gonna be a problem with my grade, right?
No. I told everybody not to do it.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, that's what I wanted to know. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh, hi,
So, Fazia,
Professor.
hi, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
So I wanted to ask you about the compositional painting.
Uh-huh.
I know I'm really late on it, but I just wanted to ask you, like, how should I go about doing it? Like, it has a lot of details.
Can you remind me which painting you're doing?
It's a painting from Edward Hopper. I forgot the name
Yeah,
of it.
I mean, what do you mean how to do it?
Like, should I sketch it first and then just fill it in?
Yeah, you can do that. You do a simple outline sketch, yeah.
Okay. And does it have to be vertical or can it be horizontal?
It should be whatever orientation the original is.
Okay.
Which Edward Hopper is it?
Give me 1 second.
Or like, what is it? What's in it?
There's a lady and a man, like in a cafeteria.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a horizontal painting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so your painting should be horizontal. You should try to make it exactly the same proportion.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah. Also, did you see like my napkin and the stars
What, did you submit them to Blackboard or by email?
through Blackboard?
Yeah, I just haven't graded them yet, but if you submitted it there, I'm going to look at them all.
Okay.
Okay?
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor.
Okay, I'll see you next week.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.